Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Torres-Spelliscy, your instructor this year. Thanks for joining me. In this week's lecture, we're going to begin our discussion of the War on Terror. In the 2 years following the 9/11 attacks, the United States would start two conventional wars, deposing governments in Afghanistan and Iraq. It would initiate a global bombing campaign with a newly developed fleet of autonomous drones equipped with Hellfire missiles. And it would begin a detention program that would push the boundaries of humane treatment. Now, there was an initial wave of support. The international community generally rallied around the United States, and particularly as it sought to redefine concepts of state responsibility so as to justify its invasion of Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda had been given refuge. But as the war expanded into Iraq and further through the use of weaponized autonomous drones, as American detention practices in prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay came to light, and as U.S. missions to export democracy to countries like Afghanistan and Libya failed, the wisdom of America's policies in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks became the subject of intense debate. The question that runs through the heart of much of this debate is this: is this actually a war? Terrorist attacks by militant extremists were not new. The World Trade Center had been attacked before. U.S. assets overseas had recently been attacked by al-Qaeda. In all those cases, the attacks have been treated as criminal acts. Investigations were conducted by the FBI, warrants were issued, arrests were made, and convictions were secured. But the response to the 9/11 attacks was different. The United States proclaimed that it had been the subject of an act of war, and that it would respond in kind. This week, we're going to focus on the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, or as they are commonly known, drones. And you will see that this question of, is this a war, is going to play a central role in determining the legality of drone use under international law. Drones have changed the way that we prosecute war. No longer are pilots of these devices put in harm's way. They are often controlled from long distances. But their use is not without controversy. Critics have questioned the way that they are deployed, particularly their deployment outside of active battlefields. They've also criticized the potential for civilian casualties. There have also been those who have questioned whether drones can be used against U.S. citizens without first providing due process.
He was, according to the US government, a senior operational leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now Washington's acknowledged that it deliberately killed US-born Anwar al-Awlaki in a drone strike in Yemen in September 2011. Attorney General Eric Holder, in a letter to the Senate's Judiciary Committee, strongly defends the targeting of al-Awlaki, saying, high-level US government officials appropriately concluded that al-Awlaki posed a continuing and imminent threat of violent attack against the United States. Before carrying out the operation that killed al-Awlaki, senior officials also determined, based on a careful evaluation of the circumstances at the time, that it was not feasible to capture al-Awlaki. Holder says the same drone strike also unintentionally killed Samir Khan, a naturalized US citizen, while 2 weeks later, Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son was killed in a separate attack in Yemen. And this man, Jude Kanan Mohammed, from North Carolina, was killed in a drone attack in Pakistan.
In the readings this week, we'll be discussing how drones are used in the war on terror and whether their use comports with international laws. A bit of history. The first UAV was deployed by President George W. Bush in early 2002, but it was President Obama who really embraced the new technology. The Trump administration similarly embraced the technology, but shifted the theaters in which drones were used to focus on conflicts in Yemen and Somalia. And although the Trump administration never released a comprehensive drone strategy, reports suggested that the administration loosened certain restrictions put in place by the Obama administration, including the near certainty standard, which required near certainty that the strike would not result in civilian casualties, and that it also reauthorized the CIA to use drone strikes. Some reports suggested President Trump authorized the DoD to initiate strikes without first getting approval from the White House. As a result, the number of drone strikes in non-battlefield settings increased dramatically under the Trump administration. The Biden administration, though, has severely curtailed the use of drones, particularly outside of active battlefields, and it has reinstated rules about White House approval before strikes and readopted the near certainty standard that was first developed by the Obama administration. In assessing U.S. policies, we must always remind ourselves that while we might be comfortable with a U.S. president making these decisions, would we be as comfortable if the leaders of other nations, including hostile nations, were allowed to make the same decisions? What about non-state actors? In light of that, what types of laws and regulations should apply internationally to the use of drones? So we need here to address two separate but related questions. First, do we treat the so-called war on terror as an armed conflict, or is it a criminal enforcement matter? The answer to that question, as you will see, in many ways determines the answer to the second question, which is, do American policies concerning the use of UAVs comply with the appropriate legal rules and regulations concerning the use of force under both domestic and international law? So let's start with the first question of which set of laws applied. Is the so-called war on terror an armed conflict or a law enforcement issue? Now, prior to 9/11, terrorism was nearly universally understood to be a criminal law issue, including by the U.S., who tried international terrorists and domestic terrorists in federal courts frequently. However, in the post-9/11 world, the conflict has been militarized. This is a significant distinction because criminal law and the laws of war have vastly different rules regarding when force, particularly lethal force, may be used and against what target. If it's a criminal matter, then under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a legally binding treaty, every individual has the right to life and is protected against the arbitrary deprivation of life. As the Human Rights Committee wrote of Article 6, the committee considers that state parties should take measures not only to prevent and punish deprivation of life by criminal acts, but also to prevent arbitrary killing by their own security forces. The deprivation of life by the authorities of the state is a matter of the utmost gravity. Therefore, the law must strictly control and limit the circumstances in which a person may be deprived of his life by such authorities. This means that a state police should only use force as a last resort. Now, how would these principles apply to the U.S. practices with respect to the pursuit and targeting of alleged terrorists? The use of drones to launch attacks against suspected terrorists and military is unquestionably a form of targeted killing. A targeted kill operation has only one goal in mind, and that is the lethal use of force. Lethal force in these scenarios becomes a first rather than the last choice. So if we adopted a criminal law enforcement paradigm, the conclusion would clearly be that the use of drones to conduct lethal strikes against suspected terrorists is a violation of international law. However, in the context of an armed conflict, the use of lethal force against an individual is permitted, provided that 1, the individual is a legitimate target under the laws of war, and 2, the use of force is necessary, proportional, and appropriately tailored to protect as best possible civilian lives. If we look at the first criteria, there have traditionally been 2 requirements to being a legitimate target. First, that the individual is a member of the opposing armed forces or is participating in the conflict, and second, that the individual is present on the battlefield. In a traditional conflict involving states, defining the battlefield is relatively easy. It just consists of the territory of the 2 warring states and their allies. Provided that the attacks are directed toward legitimate targets on those battlefields, a country is permitted under the laws of war to use the means of war to eliminate, i.e. kill, opposing forces or enemy combatants. But what about situations where a combatant is outside of the traditional understanding of the theater of war, as is often the case in the war on terror? These are difficult questions that international law is currently struggling with, and indeed there are no clear answers. When outside of the battlefield, there are also significant concerns about civilian casualties. Importantly, the laws of war don't make civilian casualties illegal per se. The laws of war outlaw the deliberate targeting of civilians, and they outlaw attacks that cannot or do not appropriately distinguish between combatants and civilians, or also attacks that are disproportionately affecting civilians as compared to the military objective you hope to achieve. Proponents of drones argue that they comply with these general rules. They suggest that drones are one of the more precise weapon systems ever developed, and that actual civilian casualties have been minimized. Critics suggest that the government employs questionable criteria in determining who is a member of an armed group, and that as a result, civilian casualty numbers are actually much higher. But if we view terrorism as a criminal law issue, then drone use to conduct legal strikes is likely illegal under international law. But if the laws of war apply, then the use of drones with appropriate precautions to protect civilian lives is likely permissible, although there is this issue of the battlefield and how to define it that we as an international community still have to give significant thought to. Okay, that does it for this week's short introductory podcast. Go on to do the readings, and I will see you on the discussion board.